The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The judge, an older white man with an air of authority, sat behind the bench. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room as he adjusted his glasses. The morning had been filled with routine cases, parking violations, minor infractions, the kind of mundane docket that barely held his interest. But as the next case was called, something shifted in the air. Case number 237, State versus Erica Monroe, the clerk announced, her voice steady but formal. Erica Monroe stepped forward, her posture upright, her expression calm but unreadable. She was a striking figure, a tall black woman dressed in a professional navy blue suit. Her confidence was evident in every step, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that demanded respect. The judge barely glanced at her as he flipped through the case file. Ms. Monroe, he began, his tone clipped and businesslike. You've been charged with a traffic violation, failing to yield at a stop sign, and an additional fine for disorderly conduct. How do you plead? Erica met his gaze, her voice steady but firm. Not guilty, Your Honor. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Not guilty, he repeated, almost mocking. You were cited on the spot. The officer's report is clear. Are you suggesting you were falsely accused? There was a brief pause, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Erica didn't flinch. I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that the situation isn't as black and white as the report makes it seem. The judge's expression hardened. It wasn't the response he expected, nor the one he wanted. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a tone of subtle condescension. Ms. Monroe, I hope you understand the seriousness of this matter. This is not a debate. This is a court of law. If you're found guilty, the fines will stand, and there may be additional consequences. I would advise you to consider your plea carefully. Erica's lips tightened, but she didn't waver. I understand perfectly, Your Honor. The courtroom murmured softly, the tension palpable. This wasn't the typical back and forth he was used to. Something about this case felt different, and though the judge couldn't quite put his finger on it, he was growing irritated. Without further discussion, he made a decision. Very well. If you're maintaining your plea of not guilty, we'll proceed with the evidence. However, I see no reason to delay the inevitable. Based on what's been presented so far, I'm inclined to rule in favor of the state. The fine for the traffic violation will be $500, and for the additional charge of disorderly conduct, you'll pay an additional $250. He smirked slightly, as if pleased with his own efficiency. Erica remained calm, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it frustration, or perhaps something deeper? Your Honor, she said evenly, I'd like to make a statement before you finalize your ruling. The judge sighed, checking his watch impatiently. You may. As Erica began to speak, her voice filled the room with a quiet but powerful authority. She explained the events of that day, not just her perspective, but the context, the nuances, the details that the officer's report conveniently omitted. She described how she had been on her way to a community meeting, a meeting to address unfair treatment of minority residents in traffic stops. She spoke of the officer's tone, the assumptions, the way the situation had escalated for no apparent reason other than her refusal to back down. The judge listened, his expression shifting ever so slightly. For the first time, there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as he studied her more closely. Ms. Monroe, he said slowly, you seem to have a lot to say for someone in your position. It's almost as if you believe you're above the law. Erica's calm demeanor didn't falter. No one is above the law, Your Honor, she replied. Not even you. The tension in the room reached its peak. The judge's face reddened slightly, but he said nothing. The silence was deafening. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice colder than before. This court will adjourn briefly, he announced, slamming his gavel down. As he left the bench, Erica remained standing, her gaze steady. The courtroom buzzed with whispered speculation. Who was this woman who spoke with such confidence, who dared to challenge the judge so boldly? In the judge's chambers, He pored over the case file once more, something gnawing at him. There was a detail he had missed, a detail that, once discovered, would shake him to his core. What he didn't yet know was that Erica Monroe wasn't just another defendant. She was someone far more significant, a person whose very presence in his courtroom would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice and authority. And soon, he would learn the truth in a way he would never forget. But for now, the mystery lingered, and the courtroom waited with bated breath. As the judge sat in his chambers, a strange unease settled over him. He flipped through Erica Monroe's case file, his fingers drumming on the desk. It was all routine. A simple traffic violation that escalated when the officer claimed she became disorderly. Yet, something about her demeanor, the way she carried herself in court, gnawed at him. She wasn't like the other defendants he saw daily, people nervous and eager to get out of trouble. Erica stood firm, almost as if she knew something he didn't. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the edge of his desk. The name Erica Monroe rang a bell, though he couldn't place it. Was it from a case he had presided over before? He rubbed his temples, frustrated. This nagging feeling wasn't something he was used to. In his years on the bench, he had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand their motives before they even opened their mouths. But Erica, she was a mystery. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Erica sat quietly, her hands resting on the table in front of her. She appeared calm, but inside, her thoughts churned. She had been here before, not in this exact room, but in this kind of situation, facing someone in power who thought they could dismiss her with a wave of their hand. It wasn't new to her. Still, it didn't make it any less frustrating. She glanced around the room. A few reporters sat in the back, scribbling notes. Most were probably here for other cases, but she knew some had their eyes on her. After all, she wasn't just another woman fighting a traffic ticket. She had a name, a reputation, and a role in the community that carried weight. As the minutes ticked by, Erica's mind drifted back to the events leading up to this moment. It had all started on a quiet Monday morning. She had been running late for a meeting at City Hall, a meeting she had organized to address ongoing concerns about racial profiling in their city. She remembered the officer pulling her over, his tone sharp and condescending from the start. "Ma'am, do you know why I stopped you?" His question had been laced with an assumption of guilt, as though her mere presence behind the wheel was enough to justify his actions. She had kept her voice steady, explaining she hadn't done anything wrong. But he wasn't interested in her explanation. The exchange escalated quickly, with him accusing her of being combative simply because she asked why he pulled her over. By the time he handed her the ticket, Erica felt more exhausted than angry. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, and she doubted it would be the last. But what made this incident different was how it followed a pattern she had been working to expose. A pattern of targeting black drivers for minor infractions while letting others off with warnings. When the officer added the disorderly conduct charge, it felt like the final insult. It was his way of doubling down, of punishing her for daring to question him. But Erica wasn't one to back down easily. She had decided then and there to fight the charges, not just for herself, but for everyone in her community who had faced similar treatment. Her thoughts were interrupted as the courtroom doors opened and the judge returned. He looked more composed, but there was a tightness around his mouth that hinted at lingering frustration. He took his seat, glancing at Erica briefly before addressing the room. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his tone measured, "before we proceed, I need to ask you a direct question. Are you affiliated with any organizations or groups that might have a vested interest in this case?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Erica tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze. "Your Honor, I'm an elected city councilwoman. My vested interest is in the fair treatment of all residents, including myself." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The judge blinked, his expression momentarily faltering. That was it, the piece of information he had missed. Erica Monroe wasn't just any defendant. She was a public official, someone who held power in her own right. He felt a flicker of embarrassment, but quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "I see," he said, clearing his throat. That's an important detail, Councilwoman Monroe. However, it does not exempt you from following the law. Nor does it exempt anyone else. Erica replied calmly, her words carrying a subtle but unmistakable weight. The tension in the room thickened. The judge hesitated, clearly recalibrating his approach. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was becoming something larger, a clash of authority, a test of principles. As the proceedings continued, Erica's attorney presented evidence that painted a very different picture of the incident. Traffic camera footage showed her coming to a complete stop at the sign. Audio recordings from a bystander revealed the officer's aggressive tone, undermining his claims of her being disorderly. Piece by piece, the narrative the officer had crafted began to unravel. The judge listened intently, his expression growing more serious. He wasn't used to having his initial judgments challenged so directly, but the evidence was hard to ignore. Still, his pride wouldn't let him concede easily. While this evidence raises questions, he said, his voice firm, it does not absolve you entirely, Ms. Monroe. There are still aspects of this case that require further scrutiny. Erica didn't respond immediately. She let his words linger, knowing that sometimes silence spoke louder than anything she could say. The judge shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under her steady gaze. Outside the courtroom, the story was already beginning to spread. Reporters typed furiously, their headlines taking shape. Asterisk City Councilwoman challenges traffic stop in court. Asterisk elected. Official accuses officer of racial bias. Asterisk judge faces scrutiny over high-profile case. Asterisk. The narrative was shifting, and the judge knew it. But for Erica, this wasn't about headlines or public perception. It was about justice, about standing up for what was right, even when it came at a personal cost. She had seen too many people in her community silenced, too many lives disrupted by unfair treatment. She couldn't let this case be just another statistic. As the session adjourned for the day, the judge called Erica and her attorney to approach the bench. His tone was quieter now, almost reflective. Councilwoman Monroe, he said, I'd like to remind you that the law applies to everyone equally. But it seems there's more to this case than meets the eye. We'll reconvene tomorrow. I expect both sides to come prepared. Erica nodded, her expression unreadable. As she left the courtroom, the eyes of everyone followed her, their curiosity growing. Who was this woman who dared to challenge the system? And what would happen next? The judge remained behind, staring at the empty courtroom. He couldn't shake the feeling that this case was bigger than he realized, that it was about more than a simple ticket. And though he wouldn't admit it, he felt a twinge of doubt. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more revelations. But for now, the tension remained, unresolved and electric, waiting to explode. As Erica stepped out of the courtroom, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. A small crowd of reporters and curious onlookers had gathered, their voices buzzing with questions and speculation. Erica's attorney motioned for her to keep moving, but she paused just long enough to make eye contact with one of the journalists she recognized. A local reporter who had covered many of the council meetings she led. No comment for now, she said firmly but kindly. Let's see how things unfold tomorrow. The reporter nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. But Erica could tell her words would only fuel the fire. She didn't mind. The attention on this case wasn't just about her. It was about the broader issues she'd been working on for years. And if it took her own fight to shine a light on them, so be it. Later that evening, Erica sat in her modest home, reviewing documents spread out across her dining table. Her lawyer had left hours ago, and the quiet of the house gave her space to think. Each piece of evidence told a part of the story, but the larger narrative was about a system that had been flawed for decades. She thought about the officer who had stopped her. His name, Officer Daniels, was printed at the top of every report. She had done some digging and found complaints against him, though none had ever stuck. Minorities in her district had long whispered about him. A cop with a chip on his shoulder, who seemed to go out of his way to find problems where there were none. As she reviewed the officer's past, another thought crept into her mind. She remembered the judge's reaction earlier when he realized who she was. That flicker of surprise followed by discomfort. It wasn't just about her title. There was something else there, something deeper. She couldn't put her finger on it yet, but she knew it was significant. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburban neighborhood across town, Judge Carter sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of scotch. His day had been long and unusually taxing. He prided himself on maintaining control in his courtroom, but Erica Monroe had unsettled him in a way few ever had. He stared at his bookshelf, his thoughts swirling. The look in her eyes, calm, unyielding, and utterly unafraid, had stuck with him. It wasn't just confidence, it was conviction. She believed in her cause, and that belief was a force he hadn't anticipated. Carter pulled up his laptop and began searching. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Erica Monroe's name appeared in countless articles and council meeting minutes. She was outspoken, respected, and often at odds with the status quo. She had been a driving force behind police reform initiatives in the city, a fact that now added a layer of complexity to her case. As Carter delved deeper, he found himself questioning his own role in the system. He'd spent decades upholding the law, believing in its fairness, but cases like this one made him wonder. Was he blind to biases he had never confronted? Or was Erica Monroe just another savvy politician playing the victim? The next morning, as Erica prepared to head back to court, her phone buzzed with a call. It was an old friend, Marcus, a community organizer who had been her ally in many battles. Erica, he began, his voice serious. I heard about what's going on. You okay? I'm fine, she replied, though she appreciated his concern. I just want you to know, Marcus continued, whatever happens today, people are watching. This isn't just about you. It's about all of us. Don't let them shake you. I won't, she said firmly, but thanks for reminding me. When she arrived at the courthouse, the energy was different. The crowd had grown larger, and a few protesters held signs supporting her. Others, more skeptical, questioned her motives. Erica ignored the noise and focused on what mattered, the truth. Inside, Judge Carter's demeanor had shifted. He appeared more composed, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there the day before. He opened the session by addressing the court. Before we proceed, he said, I want to remind everyone that this courtroom is a place of law, not public opinion. My decisions will be based solely on the evidence presented. Erica studied him carefully, noting the subtle change in his tone. He seemed more guarded, as though he was aware of the scrutiny he was under. The day's testimony began with witnesses who had been present during Erica's traffic stop. A local shopkeeper described how she had seen the interaction from her storefront, noting the officer's aggressive body language. Another witness, a young man who had recorded part of the incident on his phone, played the audio for the court. The recording captured Officer Daniels raising his voice, accusing Erica of being difficult, when she had simply asked for clarification. The judge listened intently, his expression neutral but focused. As the evidence piled up, the cracks in the officer's story became harder to ignore. But Erica knew this wasn't just about disproving his account. It was about exposing the broader pattern of behavior he represented. During a recess, Erica's attorney leaned over and whispered, We're making progress, but don't get too comfortable. The judge is still a wild card. I know, Erica replied, but we're not done yet. In the final hour of the day's proceedings, Officer Daniels took the stand. His demeanor was confident, almost smug, as he recounted his version of events. But under cross-examination, his answers became less certain. When asked why he had deemed Erica's behavior disorderly, his explanations were vague and inconsistent. He stammered when confronted with the audio recording, struggling to reconcile his claims with what had been captured. By the end of his testimony, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Erica could feel the tide beginning to turn, but she also knew the fight wasn't over. The judge called for an adjournment, setting the stage for a dramatic conclusion. As Erica left the courthouse, she was met with cheers from her supporters. But she didn't let herself celebrate yet. The real battle was still ahead, and she had no intention of backing down. Judge Carter, sitting alone in his chambers once again, couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. The evidence was compelling, the stakes high, And deep down, he knew that the decisions he made in this case would echo far beyond his courtroom walls. The tension remained unresolved, the story far from over. But one thing was certain: neither Erica Monroe nor Judge Carter would leave this fight unchanged. As the third day of the trial began, the courtroom was packed. People who hadn't been there before now crowded the gallery, curious to witness the growing tension between Erica Monroe and the legal system that seemed determined to put her in her place. The buzz of whispered conversations filled the air as reporters and community members speculated about what might happen next. Erica sat at the defense table, calm as always, but her mind was racing. She knew that today could either solidify her case or unravel everything she had worked for. Judge Carter entered the room, his expression serious. The weight of the case was beginning to show on his face. The evidence presented over the past 2 days had chipped away at his confidence in Officer Daniels' testimony. But he was not a man who made decisions lightly. This wasn't just about the facts. It was about what those facts represented, about the wider implications of whatever verdict he delivered. The proceedings started with another witness for Erica's defense, a retired police captain who had worked in the same precinct as Officer Daniels years ago. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man with a voice that commanded attention. "I don't take pleasure in saying this," he began, "but I've seen patterns in Officer Daniels' behavior that concern me." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone leaned in, eager to hear what he would say next. The captain spoke about how Daniels often targeted drivers in predominantly black neighborhoods, issuing citations for minor infractions that others might have overlooked. "It's not outright illegal," he admitted, "but it's certainly not right." Erica watched the judge closely, noting how he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This testimony wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about exposing a system that had allowed these practices to continue unchecked. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor tried to undermine the captain's credibility, suggesting he was motivated by personal grudges. But the retired officer held his ground. "I'm not here because I have something against Daniels," he said firmly. "I'm here because what's happening isn't justice." As the morning wore on, Erica's attorney introduced another critical piece of evidence: the officer's disciplinary records. While Daniels had never been formally charged with misconduct, there were numerous complaints filed against him by citizens who felt they had been unfairly treated. The judge reviewed the records carefully, his face betraying no emotion. But Erica could sense the growing tension in the room. Each piece of evidence was like a brick being added to a wall, one that Officer Daniels couldn't climb over. Finally, it was Erica's turn to take the stand. She hadn't planned to testify, but her attorney believed her voice could tip the scales. As she walked to the witness chair, the room seemed to hold its breath. She spoke about the events of the traffic stop, but she didn't stop there. She talked about the broader issues her case represented: the frustration, the fear, the feeling of being treated as less than because of her skin color. "This isn't just about a ticket," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about what it means to be seen as guilty before you've done anything wrong." Her words resonated with the gallery. Several people nodded in agreement, and even the judge seemed moved, though he kept his face neutral. When the prosecutor cross-examined her, he tried to paint her as someone who was using her platform to manipulate the court. "You're an elected official," he said pointedly. "Isn't it possible that you're using this case to gain attention for yourself?" Erica didn't hesitate. "My role as a councilwoman is to serve my community," she replied. "And if bringing attention to this case helps others who've experienced the same thing, then I'll gladly bear that responsibility." Her response silenced the prosecutor, and the gallery murmured in approval. By the afternoon, tensions were at a boiling point. Officer Daniels was recalled to the stand to address the inconsistencies in his testimony. His confidence from the first day had eroded, replaced by a defensive tone. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said, his voice cracking slightly. She was being uncooperative. Erica's attorney pressed him. Uncooperative how? By asking questions, by exercising her right to understand why she was being stopped. Daniels struggled to respond, and the silence that followed was deafening. The cracks in his credibility were now undeniable, and everyone in the room could feel it. As the session neared its end, The judge called for a brief recess. He needed time to process everything that had been presented. Erica sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, while her attorney whispered words of encouragement. Outside the courtroom, the tension spilled into the streets. Protesters gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Erica" and "End Racial Profiling." News vans lined the block, their reporters broadcasting live updates. The city was watching, waiting, and the pressure on Judge Carter was immense. In his chambers, Carter stared at his notes, his mind racing. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet he felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him. This wasn't just about one case. It was about what kind of message his ruling would send. As he returned to the bench, the courtroom fell silent. The stage was set, the tension at its peak. Everyone in the room could feel that they were on the verge of something monumental. But for now, the resolution remained just out of reach, the final verdict still cloaked in uncertainty. As Judge Carter adjusted his robe and prepared to deliver his next statement, a sudden commotion interrupted the tense silence of the courtroom. A young woman, breathless and clearly anxious, burst into the room, clutching a folder packed with documents. The bailiff moved quickly to intercept her, but Erica's attorney recognized her immediately and stepped forward to intervene. "She's with us, Your Honor," the attorney said, his tone urgent yet respectful. "She has critical information that just came to light." Judge Carter frowned, clearly annoyed at the breach of protocol, but there was something about the woman's desperate expression that made him pause. He nodded reluctantly, gesturing for her to hand over the folder. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the judge scanned the papers inside. His face remained impassive, but Erica could see a flicker of something. A mixture of surprise and unease crossed his features. The judge handed the folder to the clerk and motioned for Erica's attorney to explain. "These documents are surveillance records, Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice steady but intense. "They were obtained from a local business's security cameras near the site of the traffic stop. We believe they provide a fuller picture of what transpired that day." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Officer Daniels, seated stiffly at the prosecution's table, visibly paled. Erica didn't take her eyes off him, watching as his confidence drained away. The clerk set up the footage, and all eyes turned to the screen as the video began to play. The grainy footage showed Erica's car pulling over, with Officer Daniels exiting his patrol car a moment later. From the angle, it was clear that Erica hadn't been speeding or swerving. Her vehicle was moving cautiously before coming to a complete stop. But what truly shocked the room came moments later. As Officer Daniels approached Erica's car, another police cruiser pulled up behind him. A second officer got out, exchanged words with Daniels, then abruptly returned to their vehicle and drove away. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it was enough to raise questions. Who was that second officer? Erica's attorney asked pointedly, turning toward the prosecution. The prosecutor looked flustered, flipping through his notes. I'm not aware of any additional officers at the scene," he stammered. Erica's attorney seized the moment. "Then perhaps Officer Daniels can enlighten us." All eyes turned to Daniels, who now looked like a cornered animal. He fidgeted uncomfortably in his chair before finally standing to address the court. "It was nothing," he muttered. "Just a routine check-in." "Routine." Erica's attorney pressed. "Why wasn't this interaction documented in your report? And why did this so-called routine check-in result in the other officer leaving so abruptly?" Daniels had no answer. The tension in the room was unbearable as the judge motioned for the video to continue. The footage showed the remainder of the traffic stop, including Erica calmly asking questions while Daniels grew increasingly agitated. It was clear from her body language that she posed no threat, further undermining his claims of her being uncooperative. As the video ended, Erica felt a surge of vindication, but she knew this was only part of the battle. The mystery of the second officer loomed large, and she could sense that whatever lay behind it would be critical. During the lunch recess, Erica's attorney worked frantically to identify the officer in the video. Meanwhile, the judge retreated to his chambers, grappling with the implications of what he had just seen. The courtroom murmured with speculation, the stakes higher than ever. By the time the session resumed, Erica's attorney had uncovered the identity of the second officer, Sergeant Franklin, a veteran on the force with a reputation for staying out of trouble. He had already been subpoenaed to testify, but had provided no significant information. Now, his sudden appearance at the scene took on a new weight. When Franklin was called back to the stand, his demeanor was calm, almost too calm. Erica watched him closely, sensing that he was carefully choosing his words. "I was in the area that day," Franklin explained, his voice measured. "I saw Officer Daniels initiate the stop, and I pulled over to see if he needed assistance." "And did he?" Erica's attorney asked, his tone sharp. Franklin hesitated, glancing briefly at Daniels before answering. "No, he said he had everything under control." "Then why did you leave so abruptly?" Franklin hesitated again, and this time the pause was long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. Finally he sighed. "Because I didn't agree with the stop," he admitted quietly. The courtroom erupted. Judge Carter banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Erica's heart pounded as Franklin continued. "I told Daniels I didn't think there was sufficient cause to pull her over, but he insisted. I didn't want to escalate the situation, so I left." Franklin's admission was a bombshell. It not only undermined Daniels' account, but also raised serious questions about the culture within the police department. Why had Franklin stayed silent until now? What other secrets were being kept? The judge ordered a recess to process the new information, and the gallery buzzed with speculation. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger, the atmosphere electric. News outlets scrambled to cover the latest twist, while protesters chanted louder than ever. Erica stood by the courthouse steps, watching as the city seemed to reach a boiling point. The stakes were no longer just about her case. They were about the entire system. And as much as she felt the weight of it all, she also felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, the truth was starting to surface. But she knew the fight was far from over. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever as the trial resumed. The air was charged with anticipation, every eye focused on the bench where Judge Carter sat, deep in thought. His usual air of control was replaced with something heavier, a mix of responsibility and awareness of the scrutiny bearing down on him. Erica sat at the defense table, her head held high, but even she could feel the tension climbing toward its peak. The prosecutor stood first, delivering a final argument that felt thin compared to the mountain of evidence Erica's defense had built. "This is not about systemic issues," he said, his voice strained. "This is about one individual's behavior during a routine traffic stop. Let's not lose sight of that." But the words fell flat. The gallery was unmoved, and even the judge seemed uninterested, flipping through his notes as the prosecutor wrapped up. Then it was Erica's attorney's turn. He rose, his tone steady yet firm, and spoke directly to the heart of the matter. "This case is about more than a traffic ticket," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "It's about the abuse of power. It's about a system that too often allows authority to go unchecked. And it's about a woman who had the courage to stand up and say enough." The courtroom fell silent as he paused, letting his words sink in. Then he turned to Erica, gesturing toward her. "Councilwoman Monroe has dedicated her career to fighting for fairness and equality. She was not uncooperative. She was advocating for herself, something every citizen has the right to do." When he finished, the room was electric. Erica's supporters murmured their approval, while those skeptical of her motives seemed to reconsider. Even Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Judge Carter cleared his throat, the sound silencing the room instantly. "This court has heard compelling arguments from both sides," he began, his voice measured. "And while I understand the complexities surrounding this case, my duty is to weigh the evidence and render a fair judgment." He paused, scanning the room, and for a moment it seemed as though time itself had stopped. "After careful consideration, I find that the charges against Councilwoman Erica Monroe are without merit. This court rules in her favor." The gallery erupted in cheers, a wave of relief and triumph washing over Erica and her team. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Her attorney patted her on the back, crooning. But just as the crowd began to settle, Judge Carter raised his hand, signaling he wasn't finished. The room grew quiet again as he continued. While this ruling addresses the specifics of this case, it does not erase the larger issues it has brought to light. Therefore, I'm recommending a formal review of Officer Daniel's conduct and the practices of this precinct as a whole. It is my hope that this case will serve as a catalyst for necessary change. The words landed like a thunderclap. Erica's victory was no longer just personal. It was a call to action for the entire community. She felt a swell of pride, knowing that her fight had made an impact far beyond herself. But the final twist came moments later. As the courtroom began to clear, Erica noticed a man standing in the back, a figure she didn't recognize but who seemed oddly familiar. He was well dressed, his expression unreadable, and he was staring directly at her. Before she could approach him, he slipped out of the room. Something about him unsettled her, but she pushed the thought aside as her friends and supporters surrounded her, congratulating her on the win. Later that evening, as Erica sat in her living room reflecting on the day, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. The text read, "***, you've won this battle. Councilwoman, but the war isn't over. Be careful who you trust. ***. She stayed at the screen, her victory suddenly tinged with unease. The text was cryptic, but its meaning was clear. Someone was watching, and this fight was far from over. Erica placed her phone down, her resolve hardening. The truth had come to light, but the path forward would be just as challenging. Yet she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. The battle for justice was only beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next.